Everyone. My name is Cristiane Queiroz, and I'm the Virginia Farm Workers Program Director at Central Virginia Legal Aid Society and IDEAS Training Subcommittee Chair. Thank you for joining the Racial Equity session today. On their presentations, our speakers will address the importance of legal services organizations to adopt an equity racial justice lens to their service delivery models, as well as explain what exactly race, equity, and social justice mean. It is my honor to introduce our stellar team of speakers. In order of appearance, they are Alisa Parker. Alisa Parker has recently been appointed to the 8th District Court in Kalamazoo County. She's transitioning from managing attorney for legal services of South Central Michigan in Battle Creek. She's also co-founder of ANP Creatives Consulting, a social innovation consulting firm that equips change agents with the tools and strategies to implement transformation. Yvonne Maria Jimenez. Yvonne Maria Jimenez is President and CEO of Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County, a private, nonprofit, LSC-funded legal services program which provides free legal services to low-income individuals and families residing in Los Angeles County. Yvonne earned her BS in Business Administration at USC and her JD at Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. And our own Steve Fishback. Steve Fishback is the Litigation Director for the Virginia Poverty Law Center, where he helps legal aid attorneys develop impact litigation cases, particularly in the areas of housing and racial and environmental justice. Steve received his undergraduate degree from Brandeis University and his law degree from Boston University Law School. And without much further ado, and because there is short time and lots to unpack, Your Honor, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Christiana, and thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to set my timer so I don't go over time. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So before we start, I just like to always kind of ground these presentations in understanding that racial minority does not equal poor or poverty. I know a lot of times when we think of our work as legal services advocates, sometimes people think, well, I am doing work around racial justice because I'm working with people who are in poverty. And while we do understand that there are definitely things that have created just disparities among different racial groups, we do want to recognize that at the outset. I also like to lift up that race is not a binary. It's not just about Black and white. However, in a lot of the conversation I have today, I will speak in terms of Black. In part, that's my experience as a Black woman. And so I always like to speak about the experiences that I can relate to, but also even throughout our culture in a more global, from a more global perspective, there is a history of anti-Blackness. And so some of that is weaved in there. White people are not exempt from the harms of racism. And so we can see that through some of the housing work and other things that have gone on, and that our discussion around racism is going to be centered around racism in the United States, even though we recognize that this is a more global issue. Next slide, please. So issues of race often appear like an iceberg in that you see what's at the top. You see this grandiose iceberg. If you go to the next slide, please, though, what we see a lot of times is the event, what happened. And sometimes we see the patterns, what continues to happen. But underneath that, there is the structures that allow these systems to be maintained. So I'm going to move really quickly through these first few slides because I really want to get to the meat of this presentation. So we're going to talk about some events and patterns, and I want to lift up the story of Ma'Khia Bryant. So for some folks who may have heard this in the news, a lot of times, a lot of the things that have happened around the racial unrest in this country has been centered on George Floyd and others But as legal services advocates, a lot of times it's like, well, what can we do in these situations? Because a lot of times our work does not cross these issues. But the story of Ma'Khia Bryant was one that really touched me when I really read her story. It resonated because I said she and her family are the typical legal services client. So for those who don't know, she was 16 years old. She was killed by police on April 20th, 2021 in Columbus, Ohio. And this happened on the same day that Derek Chauvin was convicted for the killing of George Floyd. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Ma'Khia. She lived in a house with her grandmother in 2018, with her mother. And there was 5 children in this house. Paula Bryant was a renter. So she had a landlord who was unable to obtain this house, who didn't mind her credit problems. So a lot of our clients who are able to get into housing, but they have a storied background when it comes to their rental history. She also lived in a neighborhood where it once was a factory and the factory left. And so you have a lot of folks who are unemployed or looking for new work. So this is the environment in which Ma'Khia grew up. Next slide, please. So there are several issues in her household. And for folks who are wondering where I'm getting a lot of these facts, there was a New York Times article that I think is referenced in the materials where you can read more. But in this neighborhood, this was a neighborhood that at one point was a more diverse neighborhood, but suffered from white flight. There were a lot of problems in this neighborhood because it had been run down, not well maintained, not invested in. So these issues, and then there were issues, I should say, in the home, issues of abuse, for example, and the article goes into great detail. So Ma'Khia and her siblings were removed from their mom due to neglect in 2019. And 4 of the children were placed with her grandmother, Miss Hammonds. Next slide, please. So they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. Grandma slept on the couch. The children took the bedroom. The landlord found out that Ma'Khia's grandmother had all these kids living with her and said that she had to move out. So the story of a lot of our clients, especially our senior clients who end up taking in their grandchildren to try to keep the family together. But unable to find housing, Ma'Khia was placed in foster care because she was not able to find housing, which would be big enough for her to have her and all of the grandchildren in one household. So this is how Ma'Khia ends up in the foster care system. Next slide, please. So, and we'll go to the next slide as well. But of note, what was there was really just looking at the fact that Ma'Khia's grandmother attempted to get guardianship. There was a delay between when the children were placed with her to when she actually started to receive the funds, because as we know, when children are placed in foster care, the parent sometimes the foster parent will get a stipend to help take care of them. That delay in having that additional funding to take care of now these 4 children also helped to exacerbate her inability to find housing that was significant enough. And then by the time that stuff caught up to her, she was still denied guardianship of the grandchildren. So she wasn't able to get them back out of foster care. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I lift up this story to begin to talk about what were the structures in place that led to this. Next slide. So one of the things that is a really great reference is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And here we talk about how the federal government had an active role in creating housing segregation. And so Ma'Khia lived in a neighborhood that had been run down. And a lot of times when people think about these neighborhoods, they say, well, why aren't the people in these neighborhoods continuing to upkeep these neighborhoods? Well, you got to peel the layer back and look at what were the systems in place. Were there zoning laws that forbade folks to continue to build in that neighborhood? I grew up in a neighborhood in Kalamazoo where there's a factory. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood. And in the 80s, this factory wanted to expand. And the folks in the neighborhood came together and petitioned the city to prevent the zoning of allowing this factory to expand. As a compromise to this factory, the city did not grant the special use zoning for the expansion. However, they zoned lots that were vacant as unbuildable. So as houses have over the years began to deteriorate, people in the neighborhood, even if they wanted to do improvement, couldn't just purchase a lot and build on that lot. And so when you think of that kind of zoning and regulation that was going on at the city level, and this is something that was happening in Kalamazoo, and you think about some of these neighborhoods, it's not just that people don't want to take care of their neighborhoods, but there could be real laws in place that are preventing people to create the types of environment that they want to live in. And in a lot of ways, when you think about the Hilltop neighborhood that Micaiah lived in, that was once occupied by working class families, but run down, if you peel that back, you probably see a lot of that same zoning regulation happening there as well. Next slide, please. And then I'm gonna just skip through some of this, but this talks about the long-term effects of bias that are as a result. And so one of the things that Jennifer Ebert lifts up in her book, Bias, is that more than half of white people say they wouldn't move to an area that is more than 30% Black, under the belief that housing would not be well maintained and that there would be high crime. And so again, this bias is just underscored by a system or a structure that was put in place to keep people from being able to improve these neighborhoods, giving the impression that these neighborhoods are more dangerous, when in fact, more Black people in a neighborhood, the more Black people that are in a neighborhood does not necessarily mean that that neighborhood is going to be more, there's going to be more criminal activity. And there's several studies and statistics that show that is not always the case. Next slide, please. The foster care system, another structure. So in Ohio, Ohio places children in foster care at a rate of 10% higher than the national average. And Black children accounted for nearly 1/3 of children removed from their homes, nearly twice the proportion in the population. So again, when we're talking about the Ms. Hammonds of the world, these are our clients, people that will come to our offices because they're trying to petition the courts to get guardianship of their children, or they're trying to prevent eviction from happening so that they can stay in housing and keep that stability. And so when we think about, are we seeing these cases in our offices? We are seeing the cases of Micaiah Bryant. And while sometimes it doesn't always feel like the on point racial issue that we're addressing, we, by addressing some of these systems and structures and advocating for our clients, are really playing a role in helping people navigate a bigger structure that leads to the patterns and events of a Micaiah Bryant. Next slide, please. We'll skip through these, so next slide. Want to lift up here to another structure when we talk about the legal construct of race in and of itself. And so these are 3 cases. Plessy versus Ferguson is not a case about race, but it does really show us that one drop rule and what I like to call the racial jurisprudence of our nation, because there's not a little pretty bow where you can find all these cases compiled in your law schools. But as you begin to piece some of these cases together, you see that our country has a very strong jurisprudence around race when it comes to who is white and who is not. And so the Osaka case and the Singh case are 2 cases around immigration and citizenship, where the Supreme Court of the United States goes into great detail about how you define a person as white versus not white, and whether these people are then entitled to citizenship. And so I'd encourage people to go look at those cases, because the language is startling. And these are cases from 1922 and 1923. So not that long ago. Next slide, please. So the point is that as legal aid providers, our work matters, and a new approach may help us save the next Micaiah Bryant. She was in foster care, having several issues in this foster care home. She was being fought by other people in the home, which led her to try to get a knife to defend herself. And so the attack that we see a lot of times on TV, the story really was that she was trying to defend herself against bullies that were attacking her in the foster care home she was living in, and then ended up getting shot because she was lifting a knife, trying to protect herself. But how do we even prevent a Ma'Khia Bryant from getting into a foster care home? And I think about the eviction work and how relevant that is to our work as legal aid providers. Next slide, please. So a new approach to racial equity recognizes that racism isn't individualistic or intentional. And if you can really see the system for what it is, we can begin to look at the institutional culture and practices that perpetuate race inequity without relying necessarily on racist actors. So many could argue that these people weren't racist. How is it that, this happened, and why is this an issue around racism? It's because of the system and structure. Next slide, please. So I like this just visual because, again, you can't look at issues of racial equity by just looking at one bar to describe why the bird is caged. But if you look at all the bars and how they are comprised, you see that it's multidimensional. It's very easy when we see this visual of a bird in a cage to understand why the bird can't get out. And sometimes when people talk about race and racism, they're only talking about the bar. They're not looking at the entire cage. So I thought this was a great visual to kind of shift your mindset. Next slide, please. So I like to, in true law school fashion, when I think about an analysis that we can adopt and how we look at these issues, I put together what's called the Racial Justice Poverty Analysis, or IRAC method. So the first thing is identify and acknowledge the equity problem. R is redefine or provide new definitions around racism. A, approach legal problems with a race equity consciousness, and C, create solutions collaboratively. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So here, I just kind of threw together a fact pattern. You get a call from Mrs. Hammonds. She's getting ready to be evicted. Her landlord, she just took in these 4 children. What can we do to try to help prevent this problem? And she gives you the facts that I just talked about earlier. Next slide, please. Well, the first thing is we want to take time to listen to Mrs. Hammonds. And she may make statements like, I feel like I'm being targeted. I feel like this person is going to try to get rid of me for no good reason. Not dismissing those things outright is really important, and identifying that this isn't just about a Mrs. Hammonds, but this can be about a bigger problem. And even though I may not be doing everything to solve the bigger problem, how I help Mrs. Hammonds will make a difference and impact in how you help her navigate a structure, a system that can end up putting her daughter in foster care or her granddaughter in foster care. R, redefine. So these next slides I'm going to go through really quickly. Next slide. And here we have a lot of definitions. And so again, understanding that racism is not an individual act, it's not about a bad actor, but it's an ideology, a structure, and a process in which inequities inherit the wider social systems, which are related to the deterministic way, to phenotype differences and cultural factors attributed to those who are seen as a different race or ethnic group. That's a very fancy definition. In and of itself, boiling it down, racism is about the structure and the system, not about individuals. Next slide, please. These are more definitions that break it down around internalized racism, interpersonal racism, institutional and structural. So I would really encourage you to begin to learn some of these other definitions, because it also will give you language and how you speak to different systems, and also how you identify the problems that are coming into your office through a racial equity lens. Next slide, please. And then Cracking the Codes is a great resource that really breaks this stuff down. And so I know everybody's very busy as legal aid attorneys. So if you get a chance, this is a video that really does a good job of putting both definitions and then examples to break this stuff down even further. So that's a wonderful resource. Next slide, please. So approaching racial equity, approaching legal problems with a race equity consciousness. Next slide. Here, I look at a couple of approaches. So you first have the personal approach. This is what you can do internally. So that's understanding your explicit and implicit bias. And so there are a lot of trainings around implicit bias. Listen, I talked about listening to Ms. Hammonds when she comes in and not dismissing the claims around how she feels and the way that she's being treated. Acknowledging the issue. Understanding that sometimes acknowledging doesn't mean that you can solve it, but it goes a long way in helping your client be seen and being heard. When you are a lawyer, make the racial equity lens a part of analyzing your case. So asking these questions: is my client a part of a racial minority ethnic group? Does this treatment align with other marginalized communities? Is your client telling you that they face discrimination? Like, a lot of times our clients will say this, and it's easy. And it even comes from other practitioners of color to say, yeah, but this eviction, did you pay your rent? So listening to those facts are important. Is there an advocacy solution for the problem that your client is telling you about? And so if there is, how do we engage in those advocacy solutions? Continuing to read and do research. Again, this is our internal approaches, and connecting with different community groups and people. Next slide, please. The system approach is really looking at asking uncomfortable questions and going and pushing against some of the systems that we're in. So what are we doing within our programs? Is there a lack of racial diversity among our staff? How do we diversify our staff? Changing up the norm. So opening up our intake processes to groups that may be marginalized that are not coming in our door, and then evaluating our current routine and making changes. And so that's looking at your programs internally, your intake systems internally, and just several other things, and then getting trained and applying those trainings. So those are some of the systems approach. Next slide, please. Create solutions collaboratively. Next slide. So this is where I talk a little bit about community lawyering and connecting with other advocates doing the work, having your clients be engaged in the solutions building, and then using your lawyer privilege. How many of us have gone to things, and just because you're the lawyer in the room, you're told, hey, you know the answer, you know the solution. So that's a great place to lift up ways to create solutions for our clients, especially using a racial equity lens. Next slide, please. Won't go into community lawyering, so next slide, please. So I wanted to just kind of give a visual of some of the work that we've done at the Michigan Advocacy Program. We started some internal process around how do we become a more racially diverse program and do this work of equity and inclusion outside of our program. So in 2016, we started with a statement of priorities recognizing these issues. And that has led us all the way up to current day, where we have race equity caucuses, where we are really digging into these issues more deeply, as well as creating safe spaces for staff, people of color, to be able to unpack these issues. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. We've been a part of the Racial Justice Institute run by the Stryver Center, and we've also done several trainings within our program. And so even though sometimes it feels like these are small steps that we have taken, when I look at this timeline, the amount of work in a legal services program to really focus on diversity, equity, inclusion is possible. It just takes time to really change the systems and structure. And we've already seen a more diverse staff be hired, and being more intentional in this process. Next slide, please. And then this is just an example of our statement of priorities. This is in the material, so I won't read this right now, but this is where we started. And it took us about a year to come up with this statement because we wanted to do this work really, really intentionally. And so this is where we started. Next slide, please. We also tapped into our board. And so when we looked at our mission and vision and value statement, we really wanted to make sure that we were living into this. And as you see in our mission statement, we speak very specifically to racism because we recognize that this was going to be a core value of our work. Next slide. And then this is our mission statement around our diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we really break that down. Again, words matter and what you say matters. And sometimes you have to start with the words to be able to live into implementing the actual tools and strategies to create the change in your program. And so this is another example of how we did that within MAP. Next slide, please. And then there are several resources. The article about Ma'Khia Bryant is there. I believe my time is up. I'm about a minute over. And so I will turn it over to the next person.
Thank you, Alyssa. As you can see, I wasn't kidding when I said there was a lot to unpack. So now from the West Coast, Yvonne Maria Jimenez, please.
Thank you, Christiane. Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, my component that I will be addressing, hopefully I'm talking to the decision makers in the room. This is from the perspective of what an organization should do or can do, and then where you get the money for it, which is always on executive directors' minds. So we're Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County. We're quite large. We have a budget about 23 million with 170 staff. We've just surpassed 80 lawyers in our program. LA County has 10 million people in it, and that is the area that we're looking at. But one thing I want to emphasize is that despite the size of our program, I believe that the work that we've done can be done and replicated by any other program, no matter your size. I know that our county by itself equals, I think, the population of the whole state of Ohio. One of the areas that was identified on a national level during COVID-19 was the area of Pacoima. It made the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and locally, the Los Angeles Times, talking about it was one of the hardest hit neighborhoods of COVID-19, and also that the essential workers who make up this community did not have access to COVID-19 vaccinations until we, along with sister organizations, undertook advocacy to do that. And that very much has to do with race equity, and I'll get into that. Next slide. So let me tell you what our organization did in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other people, and that's still occurring, and the civil unrest that followed. I really felt that our organization needed to do something immediately, tangible, that really conveyed the fact that our program was committed to race equity, that we were going to do a lot of what Judge Elisa Parker just talked about, right? Working intentionally to dismantle racist structures. And so we set off to do that. One of the first things we did with our board is we took our strategic plan that had been completed in 2018, pulled it out, identified race equity as a program goal and threaded it out explicitly, and then set out how we were going to accomplish that. The other thing that we did was to educate ourselves. I think that is extremely important of what do we mean by race equity. And what we felt here in this program was that race equity meant that we were going to be addressing the racial dimensions of poverty and working intentionally, as Judge Parker said, to dismantle racist structures within our communities in our county of Los Angeles and the state of California. What we have done historically has been addressing structural inequalities that lead to poverty. But race equity work is much broader than that. And I think what's most important is that we're intentionally focused on the work. Next slide. I felt that as an organization, we had two conversations, an external conversation, which really looks at the program's legal advocacy, outward facing, what we do for clients, which I may say is the easier effort of the two. Then there's the internal conversation, looking at ourselves and the equity within this organization. That's a much tougher conversation. And I will say that we brought in professionals to help us deal with the internal conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. It isn't a one-time convening that we talk about and then move on. It has been an ongoing conversation. Next slide. On the external conversation, looking at our advocacy work through the lens of race equity, we asked ourselves, where are we focused? We cover LA County. It's more than 4,700 square miles and 10 million people. We asked, should we focus geographically? If so, where? What legal practice areas present the greatest issues for our people of color? And that's what we were looking at and exploring. And here's what we did. I decided that immediately in July of 2020, I would leverage IOLTA funding from the state and carve out a full-time attorney position to focus on race equity and to begin looking and researching what were the issues that were impacting our client community. Fast forward to today, in 2021, I carved out an additional attorney position and a paralegal position. So right now we have a team of 3 that are focused on it. And I'm proud to say that of the work that began in July 2020, we just filed a major impact litigation challenging race-based discrimination in a school district in our service area. We decided to focus in the Antelope Valley of LA County. Antelope Valley is known, and sometimes nationally, for its historical, bold racism. And that's exactly where we focused on. That's exactly where we filed our litigation, challenging. Right now, we filed a lawsuit challenging the state of California's lack of oversight on discipline against children of color in the school district. We will also be filing another case that will target unified school districts within that area. We looked at what were the issues our clients were presenting, and racial inequalities were really present in housing, education, and the overlay of those 2 of policing. We filed a lawsuit against the cities of Palmdale and Lancaster because they were using armed sheriffs to do Section 8 housing inspections. Most of them were families of color, mostly African-American families. And we sued on to challenge that practice. And we entered into a settlement agreement. Immediately behind us came the Department of Justice that then filed suit, not just against the cities, but also against the LA County Sheriff's Department for bold discrimination. But I won't talk about the advocacy. I'm going to leave that to Stephen. I'm going to talk about the organizational work we've done. We've met with community partners, parent groups, focus groups, because education is the area that we were focused on, and we filed our litigation. I talked about that. Next slide. The internal conversation, equity within the organization. We asked ourselves, are we standing by our convictions? The questions we asked ourselves as an organization is, if we asked a staff member at NLSLA to look through their lens of race equity, what would they say? What does the compensation look like? Who gets merit increases? Who gets promotions? Does the leadership team reflect the communities, the makeup of our communities that we serve? This was pretty personal for individuals. And we knew we were going to need help with this. Next slide. So our approach was, as Judge Elisa Parker also alluded, was to reach out to the Racial Justice Institute at the Schreiber Center on Poverty Law. We have now our 3rd cohort that is undergoing training by the Racial Justice Institute. There are many centers that do this, but the Racial Justice Institute, in my opinion, is one of the best. And it helped us to begin forming a group within this organization that turned out to be the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the organization. And here's what they did. And this again is looking internally. We're educating ourselves. We're having conversations about race equity. They took, in 2019, they took a snapshot. In 2020, they did this analysis, but they looked back to 2019 and looked at NLSLA as an organization through the lens of race equity. And they looked at, and they answered, and we have the snapshot, they answered that most people felt that most deference is given to lawyers and not to non-lawyers, that it's very difficult in the organization to work as a non-attorney professional. And I think many organizations experience that. There's a feeling that promotions are given to attorneys more often not than to administrative staff. So we're looking at all of that and having these conversations among staff within this organization that is ongoing to look at factual statistics, look at our history, and then improve upon that. our DEI committee put together a book and film club. So some of the books that and cases that Judge Elisa Parker alluded to were used here. Color of Law is an outstanding book to look at. Another one is the Stamped from the Beginning, which was published in 2016, which is a historical perspective of promotion of racial discrimination through many structures within government in the United States. It's an outstanding book. But again, the idea that we're educating ourselves, we're taking up these conversations, which were difficult conversations, because there is a sentiment, often not, that cultures have all experienced discrimination. And so the idea that we work together as a group rather than trying to distinguish who has had more of a hardship in this regard, and that we're all together on this effort. We hosted 2 salons with seasoned litigators, Murph Eman from Columbia Legal Services and Mona Tao Tao from the Equal Justice Society came and had a panel that was a national seminar that spoke about the legal work they do and how they carve a race equity challenges and lens through that litigation. We had 2 internal education seminars on race discrimination against African Americans and Asian Pacific Islander communities in California. And these were really good educational perspectives with real stories from these 2 communities that shared their experiences. And it went a long way to begin these conversations among our staff. We've also created affinity groups. So there are affinity groups within this organization that are now working to continue this organization. And one of the key things that we've looked at is that we not, the point is not to look at that white citizens are the problem at all, but it's how we work as a group together, how we also leverage our white citizens to work together on promoting the dismantling of racist structures in our communities and in our country. Next slide. So the one thing everybody talks about is funding sources. Where do we get the money for this, right? As I said, in 2020, I used IOLTA money. We had, it had been decreased, but nevertheless, I thought it was so important that this organization take on a very visible step to convey the commitment of this organization. And that visible step was not just for outward facing commitment, but internally too, that our staff understood that the leadership of this organization was moving in that direction. So we carved out that attorney position using IOLTA funding. In 2021, again, I leveraged IOLTA funding. It was increased, so we added the second attorney position and paralegal position. However, we're looking at funders across the nation, California and LA County. And let me tell you, I've been in significant number of discussions with foundations. Significant numbers of them are focusing on race equity efforts. That is their strategy, that is their charism moving forward. And I think, I believe that it's also an outcome out of 2020 and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many others, and the continuing murders of people of color, and the civil unrest that occurred, and COVID-19, which was another graphic example of the inequalities that our country, the approaches this country takes in health by the mere fact that people who were first to get vaccinations were not people of color. In fact, they were the last ones, and only because advocacy was undertaken to ensure that they received it. So on the national level, Kellogg Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation all are providing funding into race equity efforts. Some of these laser focus on particular areas or geographic areas. For example, I think Kresge is focused in Memphis and one other area in the United States, but others focus on a national level. Here in California, we've looked at our state funding, IALTA. A lot of money is also being invested in race equity work. Our foundations also are focused on race equity work. The California Endowment for its 22 strategy is putting together a 10-year plan where they'll spend $2 billion to create a more equitable California. And they've divided up the state in different regions. One of the regions is Los Angeles County. We will be bidding for funds to focus the work that we're doing in the Antelope Valley, which in LA County is probably the area where there's the most racial discrimination present. It's across, but that's a very profound. The Liberty Hill Foundation, Wyckoff Foundation, all to say that monies are being invested in this area, and you should look for them. You should research them. I'm available to help directors that really want to discuss how do we leverage money to do this work. Next slide. What are they looking for? These foundations are looking for collaborative partnerships. They're not looking to fund one organization to do this work, because it takes a collaborative of different organizations to really be effective in this work. Legal services partnering up with community-based organizations, looking at areas of workforce development, job training, social services, and looking at Clean Slate Initiatives, that is another one that ties to training. Another component that is really needed is organizing, building the people power. Now, NLSLA is an LSE funded organization. One of our main rules, we do not organize. However, we partner with organizing institutions because they are key to building the people power in community. And a collaborative partnership that includes legal services, community-based organizations that are looking at the needs of a community, and organizing institutions to build people power could be very effective and very powerful in bringing about change and in delivering the outcomes that foundations are looking for. Next paragraph. Again, just looking at leveraging existing funding, and I'm available to help anyone who's looking for funding and how to strategize and how to frame the proposals that you put together in looking for this work. Next slide. Thank you. And that's my contact information. And again, available to assist anybody who needs help. Thank you, Christiane.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for sharing all these wonderful ideas and resources with us. Steve, are you ready? It's your turn. The floor is yours.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, because I realized I was still muted. My apologies. Well, thank you, everyone. My presentation is going to focus it from the standpoint of case handlers, both individual case handlers and maybe even at the unit level. It's, you know, the two prior speakers really spoke much more globally about this and bigger picture. And, you know, I'm particularly interested in addressing people in the audience who want to do this work, really eager to, even though your employer hasn't started an initiative around this. I mean, hopefully that will happen, but, you know, until that happens, there's still things that individual legal aid advocates can do here to promote race equity in your program's work. What I also want to mention here, I mean, my presentation is entitled about litigation. I just want to say at the outset that litigation is not the only tool in our toolkit. and that there are non-litigation advocacy approaches that can also be used. I may highlight some of that as I go along, but I just also, before I even got started, I wanted to at least, let people understand that this is not simply about litigation. And even though I'm a litigation director and I'm supposed to kick up lawsuits, in my view, litigation is like one of the last tools you use, particularly if there's nothing else available. But just wanted to say that, from jump, just to clarify. So next slide, please. So why use a race equity lens in litigation or other advocacy? And here I'm going to repeat much of what Judge Parker had to say. So I apologize for that, but I think it also is good that you're hearing from two different voices, the importance about being race conscious in advocacy. We shouldn't be approaching this work like poverty affects all people the same, because it doesn't. People of color have experienced poverty differently because of the systems that Judge Parker alluded to, the bars on the bird cage. And so we should accept that that the work here might look different. It may not necessarily highlight race, but it's really important to understand how these structures of racism and white supremacy cause low-income people of color to experience poverty differently. That said, there's often other forms of discrimination acting in concert. It's not necessarily race alone. It can be race and gender, for example. In other words, Black women are experiencing a particular problem uniquely or felt by Black women. So it's not simply just race, it's race and gender, and evictions is a good example of that. But the point here is to, when trying to address racial bias, to try to unpack it to see if there's other kinds of underlying biases acting at the same time, and to attempt to address those too. Next slide. So how to employ a race equity lens. Here, before I even get started, I should have had another slide in place that says that in doing this kind of work, it should be client-driven but data-informed. What I mean by that is that it really, while it's all fine and good for lawyers to identify issues on their own and work on them, where it becomes more effective, I think, is that the issues that you identify and put this analysis to be informed by our client community, which is a pitch for getting to know the client community, trying to understand who are well, first of all, where do people congregate? Are there organizations that you should be in contact with to help inform this work? So it's my way of plugging community lawyering and trying to emphasize the importance of relationship building in this work. It really should not just be a bunch of do-gooders doing good or trying to do good. It really would be more effective if that work is done in conjunction with the directly affected. So what does this lens look like? So first, it's about identifying disparities, different treatment based, that similarly situated clients experience. And that exercise is mostly a data exercise, trying to see, okay, is this a particular issue or problem that is disproportionately and harmfully affecting a particular racial or ethnic group? Census data, but now it is a great time to be using census data because it's fresh. It'll be based on 1920, the 1920, not 1920, oh my goodness. 2020, no, we could use the 1920 census, why not? We'll get cases like the cases that Judge Parker mentioned, but no. Looking at census data, mapping is a really important tool to use in this. You don't have to create your own maps. There are a number of online mapping tools that can help identify, spatially where communities of color are located. And if there's like a particular thing, like a polluting facility, and this is from my environmental justice work, often these maps will show those type of bad things in connection with, where communities of color are located, and sometimes also good things. One other thing that you may want to use to help identify disparities is the case data that your programs maintain themselves. So for, you might want to just run a case report about evictions and seeing whether eviction is an issue within your client community that is disproportionately experienced by people of color. And that may be a red flag about, well, maybe we need to be doing some more fair housing work here. So it's, as I said, it should be client driven, but data informed. And go to the next slide, please. And this is also a plug for trying to do this data exercise early. And then, but it's sort of like, early on, there are two things that hopefully is going on simultaneously. One is the data exercise, and two is the relationship building. Because if your data analysis shows that there are, these different things with discriminatory impact, that the remedies that you may pursue in litigation or in other advocacy should be developed in partnership with those directly affected. So that's just a really important practice point. Next slide, please. Oops, 1 second, I'm sorry. Never mind. Hopefully someone else is keeping time. My clock just went bad. So here are just some examples, and I mean this is a non-exhaustive list, but I wanted to at least, give some examples of what this work could look like. So one is the use of criminal records in admission or termination decisions from federally subsidized housing. I'm actually involved in a case right now about the use of criminal records in admissions to the Section 8 program of a particular housing authority. We chose not to bring it as a race case due to resources, but this is an area that I think is really very ripe for legal aid attorneys to be engaged in litigation, particularly in this area. The second one that I highlighted is language access. Now, this is one that's where litigation might be a little bit more tricky, although I'm trying to cook up something to try to have a law, a Virginia law that says that Virginia governmental entities are not obligated to provide materials in foreign language, to suggest that that law has been preempted by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which requires all recipients of federal funds to provide key documents in the primary languages spoken within their service. So, but much of this work might be more along the lines of filing administrative complaints with a federal agency that governs, that actually provides money to the different government agencies or the courts. That would be under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is something that I spoke extensively about in the environmental justice workshop I did a few days ago. But this is a second area that y'all might want to consider doing some work in. And as far as the courts are concerned, that may involve bringing in the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department, which has historically been a very positive impact, has resulted in a lot of progress in the way that courts provide translation and other materials that are not in English. A third area is predatory lending and consumer scams. Reading there's so much written about how particularly Black families have had such difficulty accessing mortgage credit. And when they do access it, they access it on terms that are much often less favorable than similarly situated white borrowers. And similarly, there may be consumer scams directed to particular non-white populations, particularly those populations that don't speak English. So that's a third area where I think that this work is right. Next, I discussed the closing of beneficial facilities such as hospitals, schools, and community centers. So in the environmental justice workshop that I did, we talked about how communities of color frequently are disadvantaged because they have relatively few beneficial environmental amenities in their communities and have to deal with all this bad stuff, these polluting facilities. So the closing of beneficial facilities in a community of color is likely to have a disparate impact. So for example, if a hospital that's part of a larger system decides to close a hospital in a community of color, that should be raising red flags. There's possibly that could be due to intentional discrimination. It may just be a business decision where there's a less discriminatory alternative. So, but that's another area that you all should consider looking at. And then the flip side of that is like the citing of bad stuff, landfills, power plants. It may even be something much more localized, like a junkyard. Things that would tend to depress the value of property more globally. This is just another example where I think legal aid could be helpful in. And then lastly is school discipline policies. Here you may, suspensions in particular. Are children of color suspended at higher rates than white children? That could, again, be the subject of a potential Title VI complaint unless there's some real convincing evidence that there's more going on here and that those outcomes are really the result of clear racial bias. Next slide. So this is sort of where I'm gonna end off, and each one of these deserves its own. You could do your own workshop on. I just want to mention them very, very briefly. There's the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which you would bring at least in Virginia, against a state or local locality under Section 1983, and there was a whole session on that too. But what I just want to mention right now is just the factors that underlie an intentional discrimination claim. That it, so there's like 5 factors that get looked at. This comes out of Washington versus Davis. One is whether there is any kind of discriminatory impact. Does the decision bear more heavily on one race than another? Looking at the historical background of the decision, and like what was, what prompted the decision that you're challenging, and then the series of events that that led up to it, and in the actual decision-making process itself, again, to see whether any of that might be indicative of discriminatory intent, any substantial departures from like any procedural requirements or any other kind of substantive requirements. So in other words, if someone couldn't build something until X happened, but they were building even though X didn't happen, that's an example of what I'm trying to get at here. And those are the essential parts of an equal protection claim. I did mention Title VI. That covers both intentional and disparate impact. The thing I want to say about Title VI is that you can't use it in court unless you have an intentional discrimination case. So you would probably add a Title VI claim to an equal protection claim. And then fair housing laws, I think in fair lending laws people know about. The last thing I just want to mention is international human rights laws, which I included an article in the materials, which I just want you to look at. This is more of a communication strategy than actually a litigation strategy, to be able to frame what you're saying as depriving people of human rights. I think it changes the conversation. I just bring that up, look at the article. And my time is already up, so I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We're really lucky to have you nearby. Quick announcement. If you are interested in continuing this conversation, and I hope you all are, after the Q&A with Dipti, you can go to the community tab on the conference page and look for Race Equity Group. Thank you very much. Dipti is with you, Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Christian. And thank you so much, Judge Parker, Yvonne, and Steve. You guys provided a lot of good information. Wanted to thank everybody who was attending, chatting, sending messages. You have some great questions. I think the first one is a good sort of overview and trying to just generally understand how we want to address sort of these topics and issues in our office. How does the language we use matter in our daily work?
I'm happy to jump in and start answering. So one of the things I talked about is the definitions. And so I think language is really important. As we have grown as a society, we're learning better. We're learning to do better, I should say. And so it's important to be able to have the right language to identify what's going on. And so, just looking at the word racism in and of itself, so many people have different definitions of what that means. Your clients may have a different definition of what it means to be going through an experience where they're saying this person is racist, or this person, I'm experiencing racism because of whatever. And so I think as an organization, if you have a very centered approach around how are you defining racism? How do we understand people who are acting racist to be? I think that matters, because sometimes you can separate whether or not this person is good versus bad versus the reality that you yourself may not be intentionally doing something to cause harm to another person, but you are a part of a system that is continuing to produce the same outcomes to a marginalized community. And so when you have that language, it allows you to be able to, one, speak to your clients and kind of break that down and pick that apart. But then it also allows you to go to the system and some of the power players in the system to say, look, I'm not saying you're racist, but I'm saying that this policy that as a housing provider you have is creating a disparity. And if you're really not wanting to be this bad actor, here's how you can change your policy, because the impact of what you're doing is racism. So that's just one example, but I think language matters and is critical. And sometimes we don't have all the language. And so that's why these trainings and things are important, and having conversations are important, so we know how to really put language to what the actual problem is.
I would just add one thing, as Stephen alluded to, is that, or spoke explicitly about the fact that bias comes in many forms, right? And I think it's extremely important to educate ourselves. One that he identified was gender. We had an internal seminar put on by transgender staff who educated staff on language used and approaches and definitions. And it was extremely beneficial for us. So I would also say that education is looking at educating ourselves in all these various areas is important, because the language is important.
And all I'll add is that language is like one of the essential tools that lawyers have. It's always important. So I just wanted to lift that up. And in this area of work, it's particularly important.
Thank you. You know, as you all are talking, I think we're sort of among a friendly audience where we're engaging and learning about these concepts. And certainly we can probably identify maybe people even within the legal aid program, but certainly within our justice system and community who might not grasp these principles. So how do you engage partners who don't think DEI is or should be a priority? And this could be within legal aid and outside of legal aid.
One of the things that I'll attempt to answer that. One of the things that Steve spoke about was it's extremely important to get input from community, that what the community says is always informs the work that you're doing or should be doing. And when we expose partners, perhaps our own staff, to these conversations, it goes a long way in, again, educating them or opening their eyes to what does it mean when we talk about working through the lens of diversion, diversity, inclusion, and equity. I think that that is extremely important, having people listen to clients and the feedback that we get from them.
I'd just like to say that the internal piece is far more challenging than the external, as Yvonne mentioned. I wish I had a magic bullet here. Because the pushback is, while there may be, some generalizations, it's also going to be very program specific, involving like personality even. And I don't think that there's an easy one size fits all answer to the question. I would encourage folks to seek out others within your organization who are like-minded as an initial start, because you should be talking about it amongst yourselves, and to perhaps develop collectively a communication strategy to use internally, because there will certainly be people who will ask, well, why should we, focus on one group of clients to the exclusion of another? That is likely to come up. And I think the answer is, again, that not everyone experiences poverty in the same way, and we have to take into account how we deliver legal services in understanding that that's the case. It would make no sense to just do a one-size-fits-all approach to the work. So that would be at least one of the things I might say, at least to folks who internally raise objections. Again, the external is much easier. And again, I would suggest working on the external communication strategy with those who are directly affected, because they've already had to communicate, and you could probably learn something from their prior communication strategies. So that's how I would answer the question.
Thank you. No, and certainly that's a very challenging question to answer. And as you identified, sometimes dealing with the issue outside of the office may be, an identified solution may be easier. But, just to continue that conversation, how do you deal with issues that you encounter on a daily basis, even within your office? Like, how do you approach and engage colleagues who think perhaps they themselves are experts on DEI or not racist?
So I think a couple ways that we've dealt with that. One, so in our office, one of the things that we started to do when we recognized as a program, this was our priority, was we call them CARE, Conversations About Race Equity. And so that was an opportunity for us to, we did it as an option only, add on to like some of our staff meetings. So we'd either do it like over the lunch right before a staff meeting or right after a staff meeting. I do think, depending on how your office is structured, I work with a team of people who people don't want to be left out. So I think sometimes the peer pressure of not wanting to be the only one not coming to these conversations kind of encouraged 100% participation. But what we did was we started with we're not necessarily just talking about legal services, but we did the podcast 1619, or we would show clips from movies, finding ways that uses pop culture and sometimes education, so that it's not this on the nose legal services thing that we're looking at, but we're looking at this pop culture thing that now we can have a conversation, because a lot of times it's easier to have these conversations when we're talking about other people doing this versus what you're doing. And so that was one way that we internally began to look at a different way to talk about these issues without having to, I guess, shame a person for feeling like, oh, we're talking about you. But the other thing is, and this is where we developed the race equity caucuses within our program, or the race caucuses in our program, was we recognized that people of color wanted a safe space to be able to talk about different issues in the ways that working in this program impacted them. But then white people also needed a space to be able to ask questions and do some of the work. And so it's been interesting because in the DEI committee, there are certain, you have multiple offices and different people are in different places, but the caucuses is kind of this cross-program approach to bring different people in the same room. And so that was one way that we were able to kind of get into some of these broader conversations across the program. And what the caucuses allow is I know the word safe space is overused, but it allows people to really have more candid conversations. And for our white caucus, it allows white people to talk to white people about how racism impacts white people. Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about racism, we're not talking about, we're always talking about the impacts on the marginalized communities, as we should, but it doesn't mean that racism doesn't have a negative impact on white people. And so being able to even unpack some of those conversations in a space where I think sometimes when you have people of color in the room, especially if you're really intentional and conscious, you don't want to talk about the harms of racism on white people when you got the Black person sitting in the room, right? But the caucus allows that space to have a more candid conversation, to be able to unpack some of those issues. And we didn't just get to caucuses overnight. We've done training and stuff in our program to lead up to this. And this was something that bubbled up out of staff saying, this is something we want. So it was surveyed and kind of things got put together to get us to that point. So not even underestimating the training that happens to get people there. But those are just two ways that you can begin to address some of what can be uncomfortable, using some things that are fun and joy, and then using some things that are a little bit more direct.
Yeah, thank you. We're at 2:46 and I was going to give one opportunity for you all to kind of end. And I was hoping, just to kind of wrap around what you all are saying. All of our programs are different, and certainly certain programs are more rural programs, and so their diversity is different. And so I think you guys are kind of addressing different techniques. And so just wanted to hear sort of one last comment from you all just about this overall work and even how to bring in those individuals into this conversation to feel part of these efforts.
Well, let me say that feel free to reach out. We've done a lot of work internally. We did an implicit bias seminar internally that then did a survey or a test for all staff and went to what Judge Parker just alluded to, that people don't think that we're biased. Well, take the test and you'll find out that, yes, we all are. So any internal mechanism, the internal conversation, which is the most difficult, please feel free to reach out. And I'll share what I've learned.
I'll just add that this work is relevant everywhere. One of the first structural racism trainings I gave was in Vermont, which is the whitest state in the nation. And there were a lot of questions about why is this relevant to what I do? There are reasons why Vermont is the whitest state in the nation that are not very pretty. And I suspect there's a similar history in parts of Virginia that are, virtually all white. It's important to understand that history. And in addition, it's also important to make the extra step to get to those isolated communities and to see whether and how they're experiencing poverty differently. And you might be surprised. And you may be surprised in two ways. One is like, oh, I didn't even realize this was happening. Oh, well, this issue is an issue that I know other of our clients are experiencing. And it can help focus advocacy on those issues. So this, again, is relevant, rural, urban, both. And I encourage you to embark on the journey.
And then I'll just quickly end by saying, I agree with what Steve and Yvonne have said. Just being open and understand that this is a journey. The system didn't get put in place overnight. And the work that we do to dismantle it is not going to help happen overnight. And so everything is important. Everything matters. And, walk through the journey.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Oh, I see you there, Lindsay. I didn't see you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our moderators and our hosts. Thank you. We are deeply honored to have you. Hope everybody enjoyed the session. we are going to wrap up, and we have about another 25 minutes before the next session begins. Please feel free, like Christiane said, to move over to the community. There's a discussion there regarding race equity, and we can continue this valuable discussion. Thank you all so much.